Friday morning, March 13th, 2026. A Norwegian Arctic base. Minus 20 degrees. 32,000 soldiers from 14 nations are sleeping in the frozen dark, training to defend the high north against Russia. And while they slept quietly, without a press conference, without a phone call to a single ally, Donald Trump handed Moscow an economic lifeline. One night, two realities, both true at the same time. Here is what I want you to sit with before we go any further. The same week, Canada lost 84,000 jobs. The same week, Trump called your country the 51st state. The same week, European leaders were described by Politico as furious your prime minister was standing in that Arctic base, flanked by Germany's chancellor and Norway's prime minister, telling the world Canada does not need Washington's permission to defend its own north. So before you decide whether Canada is a country in trouble or a country that finally figured out the game, you need to know what actually happened in Norway, because it was not reported the way it deserved to be. Start with Wednesday. G7 leaders on a video call. 6 of them said the same thing, clearly, on the record. Do not ease sanctions on Russian oil. Do not give Moscow breathing room while Ukraine is in its 5th year of war. Trump heard it. He stayed on the call. He did not walk out. And then Thursday night, the U.S. Treasury quietly issued a 30-day sanctions waiver on Russian oil, confirmed within hours by NBC News, Reuters, and the BBC. 6 leaders, 1 call, 1 night, 1 decision made in the opposite direction. Norway's prime minister did not mince words the next morning. We were a little surprised. 6 out of 7 were clearly of the opinion that we should not release the sanctions. Russia is benefiting from that. 6 against 1. But here's what makes this more than just one bad decision. It is not the first time. It is not the second. It is not even the third. Trump broke unilaterally on tariffs. No warning, no negotiation, just an announcement. He broke unilaterally on Greenland, calling the sovereignty of a NATO ally's territory open for discussion. He broke unilaterally on Ukraine support, pulling back aid while Kyiv was still holding the line. And now he broke on the one thing every NATO ally had treated as non-negotiable: the economic pressure keeping Russia from fully rebuilding its war economy. 4 breaks, 4 unilateral decisions, each one made after allies had been consulted, each one made in the opposite direction of what those allies said. Germany's chancellor, the same man standing next to Canada's prime minister in Norway, publicly condemned the sanctions decision. Politico reported European capitals were not just frustrated, they were rethinking assumptions. And that is the word that matters here. Assumptions. For 80 years, the foundational assumption of the Western alliance has been this: when it counts, Washington shows up on the same side. That assumption is now a question. And Canada, standing in a Norwegian Arctic base with European allies, surrounded by soldiers from 14 nations, was already acting like it had its answer. Let's talk about the jobs. Friday morning, Statistics Canada confirmed it. 84,000 positions gone in February 2026. Unemployment up to 6.7%. BMO's chief economist called it one word: brutal. And that word is fair. That number is real. And anyone telling you it doesn't matter is not being straight with you. So let's not bury it. Let's start there. 84,000 Canadians woke up that month without the job they had the month before. That is not a statistic. That is a mortgage payment missed, a grocery bill reconsidered, a conversation at the kitchen table that nobody wanted to have. Sit with that for a moment. Now, here is what almost no one in mainstream coverage told you next. The United States Bureau of Labor Statistics confirmed that America lost 92,000 jobs in February 2026, the same month, the same global conditions, the same trade disruption, 92,000. In an economy 11 times the size of Canada's. If Canada's economy were the same size as America's, that February jobs number would have read not 84,000. It would have read over 900,000. And it gets harder to ignore when you zoom out. Over the 6 months prior, Canada created 80,000 net jobs. The United States, in an economy 11 times larger, created 6,000. Carney did not shout this at the journalist who asked him about the job losses. He did not deflect. He did not spin. He looked at the camera and read the numbers out loud, calmly, and then waited. Because the math doesn't need a voice. It just needs to be heard. The question is not why Canada had a brutal February. Trade disruption on the scale Trump has imposed would bruise any economy on Earth. The question is why the country absorbing that disruption is somehow outperforming the country causing it, and why that story disappeared before it ever got told. Before we talk about what happened in Norway, you need a map inside your head. Because without it, nothing that follows makes complete sense. Here's a question. Simple, direct. Take a guess before you read the answer. How many kilometers of border does Canada share with the European Union? Most Canadians would say 0. Canada is in North America. The EU is across the Atlantic. They don't share a border. That's just geography. Except it isn't. Canada shares 3,000 kilometers of Arctic border with the European Union. 3,000. Through Greenland Danish territory, therefore EU adjacent in the strategic sense, and through the high Arctic maritime boundaries that connect Canada's northern coastline directly to European territorial waters. 3,000 kilometers. And most Canadians have never heard that number stated out loud in their lives. Now think about what that actually means. When Trump questions Canada's Arctic sovereignty, when he calls Canada the 51st state, when he suggests Canada cannot defend its own north, he is not making a bilateral joke between neighbors. He is pulling at a thread that runs directly through the security architecture of the entire Western Alliance. Canada's Arctic is not just Canada's Arctic, it is NATO's western flank. It is the space between Russian nuclear submarines and European coastlines. It is the corridor through which any serious threat to the high north would travel before it ever reached Oslo or Copenhagen or Berlin. This is not speculation. This is why 32,000 soldiers from 14 nations were not training in the Scottish lowlands or the German countryside. They were in northern Norway. Because northern Norway and northern Canada are, in the strategic imagination of every serious defense planner in the alliance, part of the same problem. This is why Germany's chancellor did not send a representative to that Arctic base. He flew there himself, stood in the cold, stood next to Canada's prime minister, in front of cameras. In front of those soldiers, that image was not an accident. It was a message written in geography, addressed to Moscow, and signed by two governments that have both looked at the map and understood what is actually at stake. The high north is not remote. It is not empty. It is not someone else's problem. It is the front line. And Canada just showed up to it with its allies standing beside them. Now let's talk about money. Not budget speech money, not promise money. Signed, sourced, final bid money. Canada is purchasing 12 submarines. The contract is worth up to 40 billion Canadian dollars. Final bids were submitted on March 2nd, 2026. The Globe and Mail confirmed it. The Korea Jungang Daily confirmed it. Two bidders remain: Germany's ThyssenKrupp Marine Systems and South Korea's Hanwha Ocean. 12 submarines, $40 billion, two bidders. Take a moment and look for the American name on that list. It isn't there. Not because the United States couldn't build submarines. They build some of the most advanced submarines on Earth. Not because Canada didn't have the budget. $40 billion is not a small conversation. And not because the timeline didn't allow for it. The United States is not on that bid list because Canada chose not to put them there. That is a deliberate, documented, structural decision made by a government that has been watching Washington's behavior for the past 2 years and has drawn its own conclusions quietly, professionally, and in writing. Now, place that decision next to everything else announced that same week. 35 billion Canadian dollars committed to Arctic infrastructure, the largest single Arctic investment in Canadian history. New radar systems, new northern bases, new supply lines built for a theater of operations that Canada is no longer asking permission to defend. Add the submarines. You are now looking at a government that committed roughly $75 billion in 1 week to a security architecture that does not have Washington at its center. And then remember where Canada's Prime Minister was standing when those announcements were made. Not in Washington, not on a call with the Pentagon. He was in a Norwegian Arctic base in -20 degrees next to Germany's chancellor, watching 32,000 soldiers train for a war that nobody wants but everybody is now preparing for. One phrase from that press conference has stayed with me since I first heard it. A journalist asked Carney directly about the submarine decision, about which bid Canada was leaning toward, about the timeline, about the process. Carney smiled and said, "We are blessed by having options." Blessed by having options. Said while Germany's chancellor was standing 3 feet to his right. That is not a throwaway line. That is a carefully constructed sentence delivered to a specific audience. It tells Berlin and Seoul that Canada values what they are offering. It tells Washington that the assumption of American primacy in Canadian defense procurement is no longer automatic. And it tells every defense analyst watching that Canada has done the math and arrived somewhere new. The Pentagon is watching $40 billion flow toward European and Pacific allies, watching a country that shares the longest undefended border in the world with the United States choose, deliberately and without apology, to build its next generation of military hardware with someone else. That is not a bureaucratic procurement decision. That is a signal. And in the language of global defense politics, signals of that size do not get sent by accident. Before we get to the moment that changed the tone of the entire press conference, one thing: 90% of the people watching this right now are not subscribed. 90%. You came back. You watched this far. You clearly think this story matters. One tap. That is the difference between this analysis staying in your feed or reaching the conversations where Canada's story is actually being decided. Subscribe. And let's keep going. Near the end of the press conference, a Norwegian journalist asked the question that cut through everything. Not about jobs, not about submarines, not about Arctic infrastructure or defense budgets or trade policy. She asked the one question that every allied government has been asking in private for 2 years, but almost nobody has been willing to ask out loud in front of cameras. Do the German Chancellor and the Canadian Prime Minister still believe that the United States can be trusted when it comes to security in the North? The room went quiet. Carney paused. A brief pause. The kind that tells you the person in front of you is not reaching for a prepared answer. They are deciding, in real time, exactly how much truth the moment can hold. Then he smiled, slightly, and said one word: yes. And then, almost immediately, as if he heard how that sounded, he caught himself and said, "Do you want me to elaborate on that?" Watch that moment again if you have access to the footage, because what happened in those 3 seconds is more revealing than anything in the formal prepared remarks. The yes was not the answer. The smile was not confidence. The pause before the elaboration was not hesitation. It was a man choosing his words the way a surgeon chooses an instrument, precisely, deliberately, with full awareness of what each option cuts. Because here is what Carney did not say. He did not say unconditionally. He did not say completely. He did not say the way we always have. What he said when he elaborated was that Canada trusts the systems. NORAD, the integrated air defense architecture that has protected North America for the entirety of his lifetime. The institutional infrastructure built across decades that does not rise and fall with any single administration. That is a very different thing from trusting Washington. And then he said the sentence that I think will be quoted in foreign policy discussions for years. We are taking control and responsibility for the defense of our Arctic, not sharing control, not requesting more involvement, not asking for a seat at a table Washington built, taking control. With $35 billion already committed, with 12 submarines in final procurement, with 32,000 Allied soldiers trained and ready, with Germany and Norway standing beside him in the cold. The journalist asked whether the United States could still be trusted. Carney said yes, and then spent the next 3 minutes describing a Canada that no longer needs to find out. Let's be honest about what we are actually watching. Since taking office in March 2025, Carney's government repealed the consumer carbon tax, passed the One Canadian Economy Act, cutting major project approvals from 5 years to 2, met NATO's 2% GDP defense target for the first time since the Cold War, shipped Canada's first LNG cargo to Asia in June 2025, and this week committed the largest Arctic investment in Canadian history while simultaneously advancing a $40 billion submarine procurement that deliberately excludes the United States. These are not promises. These are completed actions with dates and sources attached to every single one of them. And taken together, they describe something that has not existed in Canadian foreign policy in living memory. A Canada that is diversifying on purpose, not in anger, not in panic, not as a reaction to one bad news cycle, but as a considered, documented, strategic repositioning toward Germany, Norway, Japan, South Korea, and Australia, allies chosen not because they are convenient, but because they are reliable. The generation that remembers the 1988 free trade debate when Canadians were told that deep integration with America was not just preferable but inevitable, the only rational path for a mid-sized economy sharing a continent with a superpower, is now watching something that debate never imagined possible. Canada building an exit ramp, quietly, expensively, in partnership with 14 nations and $40 billion worth of submarines. But here is where I have to be straight with you, because this story is not finished, and the ending is not guaranteed. Canada still runs NORAD with Washington every single day, the most integrated continental air defense system on Earth. Decades of shared intelligence, shared infrastructure, shared doctrine. That relationship does not disappear because of a submarine contract or an Arctic spending announcement. And so we arrive at the question that I do not think anyone, not Carney, not the analysts, not the Pentagon, not the allies standing in Norway, can answer with certainty today. Can both realities coexist permanently? There are two honest answers, and I want to give both of them the respect they deserve. The first answer is yes. NORAD has protected North America for over 6 decades. It is not an American gift to Canada. It is a mutual architecture that serves both countries equally. Canada can deepen its European and Pacific partnerships without dismantling the continental relationship. Strength with multiple allies has never required weakness with one. Canada has always walked this line between sovereignty and integration, between independence and interdependence, and the Arctic investment proves it can walk it still. The second answer is that a choice is coming. That a country cannot spend $75 billion building a defense architecture independent of Washington while simultaneously treating Washington as its primary security guarantor. That Trump's decision to break with 6 allies in a single night to hand Russia economic relief over the unanimous objection of every partner in the room is not an anomaly to be managed. It is a preview of a pattern that will eventually force every allied government to decide which side of that pattern they are building toward. The coalition Canada is assembling may not be a supplement to the old alliance. It may be the foundation of a new one. I genuinely do not know which answer is right. I am not sure anyone does yet. What I do know is this. On a Friday morning in March 2026, minus 20 degrees, in a Norwegian Arctic base, surrounded by soldiers from 14 nations and flanked by the leaders of Germany and Norway, Canada's Prime Minister was asked whether America could still be trusted. He paused. He smiled. He said yes. And then he spent the rest of the press conference describing a Canada that is no longer waiting to find out. That is where we are. And where this goes next, that part is still being written. Tell me in the comments which answer you think is right, because I think this is the most important question in Canadian foreign policy right now, and I think it deserves more than one voice trying to answer it.